They could have wheeled a trampoline onto the House floor today, given everyone in the chamber a go, and still elected Republicans would have used their time and energy more productively than they have in their latest adventure. Because now, apparently, the people's business includes keeping pardoned Steve Bannon out of prison. Speaker Mike Johnson saying House Republicans are working to file an amicus brief in Bannon's emergency appeal to the United States Supreme Court. Hard to say which part of that decision is more degrading, the fact that the GOP is sticking its neck out for a Trump ally who ignored a subpoena from their body having to do with a deadly attack on their own place of work, or that by arguing Bannon should have been allowed to ignore the subpoena, they're effectively endorsing a diminished version of their own congressional authority. Steve Bannon is due to report to prison by July to start a 4-month sentence for a crime he did commit. We're back with David Jolly and Charlie Sykes. Charlie, it's Mike Johnson is sort of an amazing MAGA underworld, underbelly figure. Talk about this series of choices he's making around Steve Bannon.
Well, it's the same series of choices he's made around what he's willing to do for Donald Trump, what he's willing to say, how he's willing to have the House of Representatives turned into an instrument of the obstruction of justice. It's bizarre, and I'm sorry to repeat the phrase, it is not normal for congressional leaders faced with serious issues to spend this much time trying to keep somebody like Steve Bannon out of jail. But it is an indication of what the Congressional Republican Party is and what they feel they need to do to throw sops to both Donald Trump and to the MAGA world. And it's an indication of what you would get if there was a Trump 2.0 presidency. If anybody thinks that there would be any resistance on the part of congressional leaders to the worst abuses of the Trump administration, look at the way they're behaving right now when he's not even in power, that they're willing to do this sort of thing.
You know, and the Supreme Court is once again another character in this story. Steve Bannon begged for a pardon in the final hours and days of the Trump presidency for another crime that wasn't really in dispute. He scammed his supporters and Trump's when it came to building a wall. He solicited donations. They didn't go toward the wall or anything remotely resembling the wall. They fattened his pockets, and he's now in trouble again. I mean, the issue of criminal sort of recidivism is another plot point that keeps repeating itself in Trump's innermost circle, David Jolly.
Yeah, that's right. And we're seeing the law catch up with Steve Bannon. And so you see, dying fish flop around before they expire. But what he's hoping for, and what all other Trump criminal network people are hoping for, I guess if you could call them that, is that Trump wins and somehow is able to alleviate the accountability they're facing. But I think there's a behavior that we see in Steve Bannon that Donald Trump himself has normalized, and it is the refusal to even recognize the authority of basic institutions. Steve Bannon would not be in this place of having to report to prison if he had just shown up. He didn't actually have to cooperate with Congress. He just had to respond to the subpoena and show up and then say, you know what, I'm not answering your questions for these following reasons, or I'm pleading the fifth, or exert other privileges. Instead, he just notionally threw out this executive privilege and then said, screw you guys to Congress. And Congress said, well, that doesn't work. That's not the way this works. And so when they made the referral, Department of Justice said there's been zero cooperation. Contrast that, for instance, with the Hunter Biden scenario with the United States Congress. If an adverse witness who really does not want to report at least shows some level of cooperation and some level of making legal claims in their own defense to Congress, the Department of Justice does not want to touch contempt of Congress claims. But with Steve Bannon, he just said, I don't care who you guys are. I don't recognize your authority. I'm not going to cooperate with you. The stupid part for Steve Bannon is all he had to do was show up and shut up, but he didn't do it. And now he's going to jail.
Yeah, I mean, it is the hubris. It is the sort of FU that has him in this position. Let me turn, though, to the substance of his role on January 6th. Let me show this. This is a presentation from Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren, Charlie.
But the evidence indicates that Mr. Bannon had advanced knowledge of Mr. Trump's intent to declare victory falsely on election night, but also that Mr. Bannon knew about Mr. Trump's planning for January 6th. Here's what Bannon said on January 5th.
All hell is going to break loose tomorrow. It's all converging, and now we're on, as they say, the point of attack, right? The point of attack tomorrow. I'll tell you this. It's not going to happen like you think it's going to happen, okay? It's going to be quite extraordinarily different. And all I can say is strap in. You have made this happen, and tomorrow it's game day. So strap in. Let's get ready.
Let's talk about Steve Bannon. He is a singular figure in both his sort of malevolent role he plays in attacking the establishment and his suck-uppery to the establishment. He's a prolific source to mainstream media outlets covering the MAGA movement, very proud of his contributions to it. And this just feels a little bit like the moment catching up with him, Charlie.
Well, it is. I mean, he is the id of the MAGA movement at this point. But keep in mind that he is doing the bidding of the former president of the United States, the future president of the United States. And let's go back to Mike Johnson. That Mike Johnson is looking at him and says, this is our guy. This is somebody that we want to defend. This is somebody who is a victim. So the larger picture here is the assault on any sort of legal accountability for people who were involved with January 6th. This is part of this revisionist history, turning January 6th into some sort of legitimate protest. And Republicans in Congress are now all in on all of this. So, Donald Trump is out on a regular basis, joining himself with the January 6th rioters, pledging that he will pardon all of them. And in many ways, Steve Bannon is just a symbol of all of that. What's extraordinary is that Mike Johnson has a choice to make. He could distance himself from that, deal with the business of the country, put the country over this, and move on. Instead, because Donald Trump is demanding it, he has to go and use his authority to try to defend Steve Bannon, who is obviously deeply involved in the conspiracy to try to overturn this election. But again, this is all part of this continuum, this attack on the criminal justice system, this insistence that they are all victims, and the fact that the Republican Party, the party of law and order, and I can't get over this, I'm sure David can't either, the party of law and order, you go now to a Trump rally and people are going, I'm voting for the convicted felon. The chairman of the Republican Party in the county that I'm sitting in right now had an op-ed piece. I am voting for the convicted felon. And the more felons they are, the more zealous I'm going to be in supporting them. I mean, we are in a really weird moment in American politics. And it's not just, and when we talk about democracy, but there's a real assault on the concept of the rule of law if you delegitimize the entire criminal justice system and you turn criminal behavior like Steve Bannon's into some sort of a martyrdom.
Hi there, everyone. It's 4 o'clock in the East. Another day, another issue surrounding the United States Supreme Court's transparency and competence. The court, which still has decisions on a dozen argued cases yet to be announced this term, today inadvertently posted online a document related to an abortion case, which was obtained by Bloomberg Law. A Supreme Court spokeswoman confirmed that the document was, quote, inadvertently and briefly uploaded, but noted that the ruling has not been released and would be in due course. NBC News has not independently verified the document. It is not known if it is a draft decision, the actual decision, or neither of those things. The document has since been removed from its website. But what the document did signal was that the court appears set to allow emergency room doctors in the state of Idaho to perform life-saving abortions, which they are unable to do under that state's Defense of Life Act that passed in August of 2022. The law is one of the most extreme abortion bans in the country. It prohibits nearly all abortions and does not allow for exceptions when the life of the mother is at risk. While this potential ruling by the Supreme Court sounds and feels like good news, like a win for abortion rights advocates, In actuality, it amounts to a punt by the highest court. It simply means that a ruling from the lower court, which had paused Idaho's ban on abortion health care, would be reinstated, and that the court did not rule on any of the merits of this case. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson makes all of these points in writing this, quote, "Today's decision is not a victory for pregnant patients in Idaho. It is delay. While this court dawdles and the country waits, pregnant people experiencing emergency medical conditions remain in a precarious position as their doctors are kept in the dark about what the law requires." Now, this comes just one day ahead of the first 2024 presidential debate, as President Joe Biden has made the protection of women's reproductive freedom a centerpiece of his campaign.
Decades of progress shattered just because the last guy got 4 years in the White House. We know what will happen if he gets another 4. For MAGA Republicans, Roe is just the beginning. They're going to try to ban the right to choose nationwide. They're coming for IVF and birth control next. We're up against extremism. Send me back to the White House and I'll fight like hell to restore Roe v. Wade and protect American freedom.
Now, in addition to the impact on abortion rights here in America, the temporary posting of the document on the Supreme Court's website also raises questions about why a second abortion-related case after Dobbs reached the public, inadvertently it seems, before the court officially released it, as well as what other decisions from the court that are done and ready are just sitting there. It's where we start the hour with some of our most favorite reporters and friends. Senior editor for Slate, host of the Amicus podcast, Dahlia Lithwick, is here. Plus, the president of Reproductive Freedom for All, Mini Timuraju, is here. MSNBC legal analyst, NYU law professor Melissa Murray is back. And former Obama White House policy director, MSNBC medical contributor, Dr. Kavita Patel is here. The four of you could and are changing the world. It's an honor to have all of you here with us. I mean, Dahlia, help me sift through what this is, what we think happened.
I mean, I think that this, unlike the Dobbs leak, was probably a kind of a technical screw up that happened. Somebody uploaded an opinion that was clearly not ready by its appearance to be sort of released today, and somebody uploaded it onto the court website, and the good people at Bloomberg Law said, hey, we see it, because all of us are busy going refresh, refresh, refresh to see what else is coming. And so we've got a draft opinion, but I think this is more in the bucket of if the Supreme Court behaved like an ordinary, transparent institution, embarrassing things like this wouldn't happen. And if they happen, they get corrected quickly. Then in the bucket of the catastrophic Dobbs leak, it's still very embarrassing.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the problem with an institution whose public approval is plunging farther and faster than any other institution in civic life is the inability to own a mistake. I mean, why not? I mean, and if it's ready, why not release it today, Dahlia?
I mean, it is hard not to think that if it was ready, it should be released today. We're always told that there's no partisan valence or political valence to when cases come down. We're told, in fact, we're scolded that it's all just, they come down when they're ready. So this certainly suggests either that someone is still drafting something, in which case it wasn't ready, or that, the court is a little bit more political in its release of cases than any of us thought. But we're not going to know. And again, the fact that the court just sort of turned out the lights at 11 o'clock and said, we'll figure it out tomorrow, really, I think, speaks to this, again, imperial view of itself as beyond reproach. I'm sure we're minutes away from hearing that it's the press's fault again.
Predictable, but depressing and certainly not helpful to the court. Let's deal with the document that was posted. Today's document has this from Samuel Alito in a dissent, obviously. The right to refuse medical treatment without consent does not entail the right to demand treatment that is prohibited by law. Cancer patients have the right to refuse treatment that their doctors recommend, but they do not have a right to obtain whatever treatment they want, such as the administration of a drug that cannot legally be used in the country, granting terminal patients the right to try experimental drugs. Likewise here, a woman's right to withhold consent to treatment related to her pregnancy does not mean that she can demand an abortion. I mean, Dr. Dr. Patel, there is still this delusion that women are out there demanding abortions, like they demand, Spanx undergarments or Manolo Blahniks. It's a view, obviously, seemingly shared in the household. It's wrapped in the disinformation that's been peddled by the extreme wing of the pro-life movement for decades. It's incredibly out of step with American public opinion, and it's incredibly out of step with anything that happens inside a doctor's office between a patient and a doctor. Tell me what you think of what we're seeing in this document. We, again, don't know if this is a final opinion.
Yeah, Nicole, what might be easier is to actually tell people what's happening on the ground. So a pregnant patient might come to the emergency room or their doctor's office for a variety of reasons: high blood pressure, bleeding, or one of the most common things in the emergency room. It happened 54 times at St. Luke's Boise, Idaho Hospital last year, is that a patient's water breaks before a fetus can live outside of the womb, around or before 20 to 22 weeks of gestation. After the water breaks, there's usually a fetal heartbeat, but you can have infection quickly spread. You and I have talked about sepsis, which is life-threatening. Without a ban in place, what normally would happen is the doctor would likely recommend termination of the pregnancy to avoid sepsis and the death or potential death of the mother and the fetus. With this ban, what is happening today is that specialists are having to make a judgment call, having to think about talking to the administration, and in many cases, having to send a patient out of state. Keep in mind, the nearest place they can send them to is Portland or Seattle, and that's about 8 hours away, that can freely offer medical care. We're not talking about offering abortions on demand. We're talking about medical care. So those comments by Justice Alito, and it just makes my blood boil, because we're not talking about on-demand health care. Making that analogy to cancer is disrespectful to cancer patients and to people. And what we're really talking about is just access to care. And that's why I think you saw that outrage in Justice Jackson's statement, which is only the tip of the iceberg of what's happening on the ground.
Yeah, Minnie, let me read more from, again, this document. In this document, this is from Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, who wrote a concurring and a dissenting opinion. Quote, "We cannot simply wind back the clock to how things were before the court injected itself into this matter. Our intervention has already distorted this litigation process. We permitted Idaho's law to go into effect by staying the district court's injunction in the first place, then allowed this matter to sit on our merits docket for 5 months while we considered the question presented. It is too little, too late for the court to take a mulligan and just tell the lower courts to carry on as if none of this has happened. As the old adage goes, the court has made this bed, so now it must lie in it." Wow.
Could not agree with her more. I mean, look, the court had a chance to do the right thing here. The court had a chance to resolve this. This case was all about preemption. The Biden administration really trying to figure out, how do we save women's lives in states with abortion bans? How do we provide and make sure they have the critical care, life-saving care they need in the cases that Dr. Patel just outlined? The court could have done something about it. Instead, it's completely unconscionable that they've punted this. It is, in some ways, probably a better outcome than what many of us expected from this court, but it is a short-term win. Ultimately, what we need to see happen is abortion bans lifted. The Biden administration is doing everything they can in the margins to protect women's lives, but it is just simply not enough. This court is not to be trusted. We have to win a federal trifecta to reestablish a federal right to abortion. It is the only solution. It is dangerous to have to continue to go to this court. And this court has not shown, the majority of this court, any willingness to do the right thing. This is so similar to the medication abortion situation as well, where they just dismissed the case on standing. But Justice Kavanaugh laid out how to challenge medication abortion the next time. They are just not willing to make the hard decisions after the devastation that they created in overturning Roe.
I'm a proud conservative. I always have been. As a proud conservative, I've always put democracy and our Constitution above all else. And it's because of my unwavering support for democracy that today, as a proud conservative, I'm endorsing Joe Biden for re-election.
Hi again, everyone. It's now 5 o'clock in the East. Words that would have been unimaginable just a few years ago. A stalwart, self-described conservative, a one-time Tea Party darling, crossing the political aisle to protect our democracy, as he puts it. President Joe Biden heading into an historic debate tomorrow night against the man who sought to end democracy, with wins in his sails thanks to an endorsement from a member of the other political party. Former Congressman Adam Kinzinger telling voters that Donald Trump is just too dangerous to be sent back to the White House.
Donald Trump poses a direct threat to every fundamental American value. He doesn't care about our country. He doesn't care about you. He only cares about himself. And he'll hurt anyone or anything in pursuit of power. He attacked the foundation of this nation, encouraging a violent mob of his supporters to march on the Capitol to prevent the peaceful transition of power. Now he's become even more dangerous. He's called for termination of the Constitution. He wants to be a dictator on day one. He actually said that. And he's continuing to stoke the flames of political violence. Now's the time to unite behind Joe Biden and show Donald Trump off the stage once and for all.
President Joe Biden retweeting Adam Kinzinger's endorsement and saying this, quote, "This is what putting your country before your party looks like. I'm grateful for your endorsement, Adam." This full-throated repudiation of Donald Trump, an enthusiastic endorsement of President Joe Biden, comes from one of the 10 members of Congress who did more than nearly anyone else in revealing the inner workings of the Trump coup plot of 2020, showing the entire nation and the world that what happened on January 6th wasn't some tragic accident. It wasn't something that just went too far. It was the result of months of deliberate plotting on the part of Donald Trump and seeding a lie on the part of Donald Trump that the election he lost was stolen from him, putting that lie in the minds of millions of Trump supporters, and that as the mob stormed the Capitol, Trump sat back and watched his work.
At the same time that President Trump was acknowledging privately that he had lost the election, he was hearing that there was no evidence of fraud or irregularities sufficient to change the outcome. The president and his allies became keenly aware that with legal challenges exhausted and electoral votes certified, their only hope would be a last-ditch scheme to prevent Congress from certifying the win, thus throwing the entire system into constitutional chaos. President Trump ultimately wanted the Department of Justice to say the election was, quote, corrupt and, quote, leave the rest to me and the Republican congressmen. We know many of President Trump's vocal supporters on January 6 also wanted the Justice Department to do whatever he asked, as long as it meant he could stay in power. President Trump did not fail to act during the 187 minutes between leaving the ellipse and telling the mob to go home. He chose not to act.
His work on the January 6th Select Committee earned Adam Kinzinger Donald Trump's wrath. It came with death threats. The arc of Kinzinger's time in public life after January 6th stands in stark contrast to so many of his fellow Republicans who choose instead to overlook Trump's role in plotting the insurrection or make excuses or go straight down the rabbit hole of Trump's conspiracies around the 2020 election. Now, Adam Kinzinger is speaking to many of his fellow Republicans out there who may be looking for that permission structure to pull the lever and cross over and vote just this one time, maybe, for President Joe Biden, saying, quote, "There's too much at stake to sit on the sidelines." It's where we start the hour with some of our favorite experts and friends. Former Republican Congressman, MSNBC political analyst David Jolly is here. Also joining us, MSNBC columnist and contributor Charlie Sykes is here. And Democratic strategist and president of Brilliant Corners Research, MSNBC political analyst Cornell Belcher is here. I want to start with you, David Jolly. And I want to dispel the notion that people like Adam Kinzinger or Judge Luttig or Liz Cheney were squishy and could go either way on policy. The three of them in particular, hardcore right-wing conservatives who see a constitutional and a democracy argument in not just abandoning Joe Biden, abandoning Donald Trump, but embracing and endorsing, I guess Liz Cheney hasn't taken that step yet, but she certainly seems to be inching in that direction, as is Judge Luttig. But just talk about the impact of not just sort of wearing the Never Trump jersey, but of becoming a Biden supporter for Adam Kinzinger.
Yeah, I love your framing, Nicole, because not all never Trumpers or disaffected Republicans are hard right conservatives, right? I was traditionally a squishy moderate. I'm still a squishy moderate, happy to ally with Democrats and Joe Biden. But the likes of Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney and Luttig and others, they have real ideological reservations. They oppose a lot of what the Biden administration does. These are not squishy moderates. And so the import of that is they're acting on conviction to put democracy in the country first in their view of the world. And it's, what you often talk about, the permission structure for hard right conservatives who may oppose Joe Biden on policy, recognizing that in their view of the world, there's something greater. I think the other important thing that we're seeing here, and it's been well reported that Adams' former chief has gone over to the Biden camp to help organize and coalesce disaffected Republicans. We see the endorsement now of the former congressman. Absolutely living in that former Republican member world, I can tell you the uptick in activity among the Biden campaign to reach out to disaffected Republicans, even currently registered Republicans, that uptick is real. And if we're seeing it at the grass tops, if you will, the former electeds, they also have a plan for digital targeting to reach that Nikki Haley voter who said, I can't vote for Donald Trump. If the Biden camp is reaching Adam Kinzinger, they're reaching Adam Kinzinger's cousins down there, the other disaffected voters that you may have never heard of. And that's an important moment for the Biden campaign to make that move.
Yeah, I mean, Charlie, the right can't figure out what to do with the sort of never Trump coalition. I too, am a squish and was never super comfortable with the hard right positions of the Republican Party. Voting for Hillary Clinton was the easiest vote I'd ever cast. A lot of Republicans said it was the hardest thing I'd ever done. It was one look at Donald Trump. It was the easiest vote I ever cast, followed very closely by a tie for the easiest vote I ever cast for Joe Biden. Donald Trump is such a glaring threat to any Republican who's been active in the last 20 years, who saw democracy as this cause worthy of trying to export. I mean, the hypocrisy, the rank hypocrisy, means that Republicans owe more to the country. They owe more to the democracy to try to undo Republican support for Trump.
Well, and Adam is so clear. His message, I was really struck by the clarity of his message about the danger that Donald Trump poses. And to David's point, though, this is not easy for people like Adam Kinzinger. It's not easy for people like Judge Luttig and Liz Cheney because they are conservatives. They do not embrace the entire Biden agenda. They're not waving pom-poms here, but they have looked at exactly what Donald Trump has done, what he is saying he's going to do, and the prospects of another Trump presidency. And so I do think that it's significant, and I do think that you're going to see more Republicans joining. And again, the fact that these are conservative Republicans is crucial for providing that permission, that to go to conservatives who will list all the things they don't like about the Biden administration and say, okay, this is not about right and left right now. This is about that vertical, the vertical line of democracy and authoritarianism. And I think it's very important. And think about where Adam Kinzinger falls in all of this, because we've had so many other Republicans saying that they are not going to vote for Donald Trump again. Now, Mike Pence hasn't gone as far as Adam Kinzinger, but it is extraordinary that you have Donald Trump's former vice president saying he will not vote for him. It is extraordinary when you have, members of the Trump cabinet saying we do not want him back in power again. And there will be more. I mean, I would expect that you're going to hear from Liz Cheney. And so going into November, you're going to have a compelling case of people who are crossing the lines and saying, look, we are putting our ideological differences aside for this moment because of what Donald Trump represents and the threat to our Republican system of government that he represents.
Why would Americans assume that our Constitution and our institutions in our republic are invulnerable to another attack? A key lesson of this investigation is this: our institutions only hold when men and women of good faith make them hold. regardless of the political cost. We have no guarantee that these men and women will be in place next time. Any future president inclined to attempt what Donald Trump did in 2020 has now learned not to install people who could stand in the way.
That was former Congresswoman and January 6th Select Committee Vice Chair Liz Cheney sounding the alarm about the all too dangerous lessons that the disgraced ex-president and his allies learned from their first failed attempt to steal an election. Now, brand new reporting in the Washington Post has uncovered a widespread effort by GOP officials to block certification of election results in key battleground states. Post writes this, quote, since 2020, county-level election officials in 5 key battleground states, Georgia, Arizona, Michigan, Nevada, and Pennsylvania, have tried to block the certification of vote tallies in both primaries and general elections. While so far these efforts have failed, they could upend the next election. Quote, voting rights advocates believe that unsubstantiated claims of fraud by Trump and his allies are sowing even deeper mistrust in the fall election results than they did 4 years ago, raising the potential for unrest and even violence on a greater scale, too. And as Liz Cheney warns, many of the people who stopped Trump in 2020 are no longer there. They've been replaced with true believers of Donald Trump and the big lie. Joining us now, voting rights attorney, the founder of the site Democracy Docket, Mark Elias. Mark, we've had a lot of conversations just this week about, one, this sort of lull in the chatter around domestic violent extremism tied to the big lie. We've dug into what's being peddled to Trump supporters on Fox News, and it's this certainty that Trump will win, and if he doesn't, it's fraud. That feels like an even deeper and more dangerous line than what they towed in 2020, which was more, we think we're going to win. If we don't, we'll go look and manufacture fraud. How do you feel about the tracks that are being laid by Trump?
I am very, very worried. The fact is that after the violent insurrection on January 6th, Republicans had a choice. They could either back away from the brink, they could distance themselves from Donald Trump and his lies, they could tell the truth, which was that Donald Trump lost the 2020 election fair and square, or they could do what they eventually did, which is to double down on the lies, which is to say with more certainty that Donald Trump won 2020 when he didn't, and to insist that there is some broad deep state conspiracy, whatever that means, to deny Donald Trump the election again in 2024. And so this has been building slowly. You know, the Washington Post talks about the attacks on certification. Let's remember, it was Ronna McDaniel and Donald Trump who got on the phone with the 2 Republican members of the Wayne County Canvassing Board in 2020 to try to convince them not to certify the election results. When that failed, the Republicans tried to get the Republican members of the statewide Canvassing Board not to certify. That almost succeeded, but it failed. In 2022, Cochise County, Arizona, refused to certify the election results. My law firm and we sued them to force them to certify. Those election officials have now been indicted by the state. In Pennsylvania, three counties refused to certify in the primary election. One county, Luzerne County, refused to certify in the general election. We sued them and forced them to certify. This has been building over and over again. Building up and up, rather. But it's much more dangerous for 2024 because the true believers, as you point out, are now more firmly in control of these offices.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.